"Start my royal carriage, and it's yours." The command exploded across Trafalgar Square like thunder across an empire. King Edmund Sutherland II's voice carried the weight of absolute power, the kind of authority that had conquered nations and crushed rebellions without mercy. It was the afternoon of the Royal Market of 1805, and London displayed itself in all its Georgian magnificence. The square stretched before him like a perfectly designed stage, framed by facades of honey-colored stone that rose toward a sky streaked with the smoke of progress. Marble columns stood sentinel, carved with the victories of British supremacy, while iron lampposts, newly installed and gleaming like soldiers at attention, cast geometric shadows across cobblestones polished by 1,000 carriages. "Start my royal carriage, and it's yours," Edmund repeated, his smile a blade wrapped in velvet. The air itself seemed weighted with privilege. It smelled of expensive perfumes, mixing with the aroma of roasted chestnuts from street vendors, of leather and horse sweat, of freshly printed pounds sterling changing hands in business conducted beneath silk parasols. Crystal chandeliers visible through the windows of the surrounding townhouses caught the afternoon sun, scattering prisms of light like captured rainbows, reminding everyone present that even natural beauty could be possessed, contained, displayed as proof of dominance. Around the king, the British aristocracy had gathered like moths to a flame of cruelty. Lords in military coats decorated with medals that told stories of colonial conquests stood with their chests puffed out, hands resting on sword hilts they would never need to draw. Ladies in empire waist silk gowns the colors of precious gems, emerald, sapphire, ruby, held gloved hands to their mouths, not to hide shock but to frame their laughter, making it more elegant, more cultured, more devastating. Their fans, painted with pastoral scenes of shepherdesses who never knew real poverty, fluttered like the wings of predatory birds. "Your Majesty displays such wit," exclaimed Duke Harrison Blackwell, his voice oily with the kind of flattery that built careers in court. His waistcoat, embroidered with gold thread in patterns that cost more than a workman's yearly wage, strained across his substantial belly. "A beggar operating royal machinery. It's brilliant theatre." "The wretch can barely stand upright," added Lady Constance Pemberton, her diamonds catching light with every dismissive gesture. "How could he possibly comprehend engineering that required the finest minds in England?" Her laugh tinkled like breaking glass, sharp and cutting. The crowd pressed closer, a tide of silk and wool, of polished boots and pristine gloves, of faces flushed with wine and the peculiar excitement that comes from witnessing another's humiliation. They formed a wall of privilege, an impenetrable fortress of inherited wealth and assumed superiority. Their murmurs rose and fell like waves against a shore, each voice adding to the symphony of contempt. Some had traveled from their estates specifically for the royal market, where the aristocracy showcased their latest acquisitions, exotic animals, foreign artifacts, technological marvels, while the common people looked on from the edges, permitted to witness, but never to touch. At the center of this spectacle stood the golden carriage, Edmund's prized possession. It was a masterpiece of engineering and artistry, its body crafted from panels of burled walnut, so perfectly matched they seemed to flow like water frozen in wood. Gold leaf covered every edge and corner, applied by hand in sheets thinner than butterfly wings, catching and throwing back the sun until the vehicle seemed to glow with its own inner fire. The royal crest, emblazoned on both doors, featured a lion and unicorn, rendered in such exquisite detail that individual fur and scales were visible. The windows were made of glass so clear it seemed invisible, held in frames of gilded bronze worked into patterns of roses and thistles. Leather seats, dyed a deep burgundy, were studded with buttons of polished jet. The wheels, 5 feet tall, were constructed of 16 perfectly curved spokes each, painted in alternating stripes of gold and black, but those wheels would not turn. Edmund had made certain of that. Earlier that morning, in the privacy of the royal stables, he had instructed his chief engineer to sabotage the axle, subtly, in a way that would be invisible to casual inspection, but would prevent the carriage from moving an inch. The challenge was not meant to be met. It was meant to be failed, spectacularly, publicly, providing entertainment for the bored nobility and reinforcing the natural order of society. Those at the top belonged there, and those at the bottom deserved their station.
"Come here, useless beggar!"
Edmund's voice cut through the air again, his arm extended toward the edge of the square, his finger pointing like an accusation. "They say street rats know every trick of survival. Prove your worth to this nation that has given you so much. Make this carriage roll without my engineer's assistance, and I shall gift it to you with all the gold and jewels inside." His smile widened, showing teeth as white and even as piano keys. Unless, of course, you prefer to crawl back to whatever gutter spawned you. The crowd erupted in laughter that echoed off the Georgian facades, bouncing between buildings, amplifying, until it seemed the very stones of empire were mocking. A young lord, barely 20 and already drunk on power and brandy, shouted, "He can barely walk, let alone fix anything. Look at how he trembles." Another voice, female and cutting, added, "Perhaps we should offer him a penny for trying." "Oh, wait, beggars can't be choosers." The laughter grew louder, more savage, feeding on itself like a fire given fresh kindling. At the edge of Trafalgar Square, separated from the aristocracy by more than just physical distance, stood the forgotten citizens of London. Here were the flower sellers with their wilting bouquets, the pie vendors whose products were growing cold, the chimney sweeps still blackened from morning labor, the maids on errands for households that would never acknowledge their existence. They watched the spectacle with the resigned expressions of people who had seen such cruelty before, who expected nothing different, who had learned not to hope. And among them, unnoticed until this moment, stood Thomas Whitmore. He was a figure that eyes slid past without registering, the kind of invisibility that poverty grants. 72 years had weathered him like a ship left too long at sea. His hair, once thick and dark, now hung in grey strands that brushed shoulders permanently stooped from decades of bending over workbenches. His face was a map of hardship, deeply lined around eyes that were the color of storm clouds, creased at the corners from years of squinting at delicate work in dim light. His hands, gnarled and spotted with age, trembled slightly as they gripped a wooden cane worn smooth by constant use. The knuckles were swollen with arthritis, the fingers crooked from breaks that had healed poorly. His clothing told its own story of decline. The coat, once a respectable brown wool, was now the indeterminate color of dirt and despair, patched at the elbows with fabric that didn't quite match, missing buttons replaced with bits of string tied through the holes. His shirt, visible at the collar and cuffs, had been washed so many times the fabric was nearly transparent, and what had once been white was now the grey of old snow. His trousers, held up by a rope belt, were frayed at the hems, and his shoes, if they could still be called that, were held together more by habit than leather, the soles thin enough that every cobblestone pressed through to his feet. He carried no possessions, no bundle of belongings, nothing that marked him as human beyond the basic fact of his existence. To the aristocracy, Thomas was less than furniture. Furniture at least had function and value. He was simply part of the urban landscape, as unremarkable as the lampposts, as disposable as yesterday's newspaper. But beneath that broken exterior, Thomas Whitmore carried something that no amount of poverty could strip away. In his grey eyes, if anyone had bothered to look closely, there lived a light that spoke of knowledge and mastery, of skills honed over a lifetime, of a craft so deeply embedded in his bones that age and destitution could not erase it. His fingers, trembling though they were, retained a memory that transcended conscious thought, the memory of wood grain and metal stress, of angles and tolerances, of balance and proportion. In the inside pocket of his coat, pressed against his heart, Thomas carried a single possession, a daguerreotype photograph in a tarnished silver frame. The image, fading now, showed a young man with Thomas's eyes and a smile that could light a room. Richard Whitmore, aged 27, standing beside the very carriage that now sat before the king. The photo had been taken on the day they completed it, both their names carved into the underside of the driver's seat. Whitmore and Son, Masterworks of London, 1770. Thomas had not spoken of that day in 20 years. He had not spoken of much at all since the night his workshop burned, since the accusations of treason that were never proven but never disproven, since the mob arrived with torches and rage, since Richard had run back inside to save the tools and never emerged. The official report said it was an accident. Thomas knew better. He had seen the king's father's men in the shadows, had heard their whispers about a carriage maker who refused to build weapons of war, who had principles that made him inconvenient. The craft we create with our hands, Father, never dies. Richard's last words to him, spoken that very morning before the fire. It lives in every wheel that turns, every joint that holds, every carriage that carries people safely home. Thomas had carried those words for 2 decades, wrapped around his heart like armor against a world that wanted him to disappear. Now, as Edmund's challenge hung in the air like smoke, something shifted in Thomas. Perhaps it was the particular cruelty of seeing his life's masterwork weaponized against him. Perhaps it was the memory of Richard's voice, which in this moment sounded as clear as if his son stood beside him. Perhaps it was simply that a man can only bend so far before he either breaks or stands upright. Thomas straightened his spine, vertebra by vertebra, a process that hurt after years of stooping. His trembling hands steadied, gripping the cane not as support but as a walking stick. He took a step forward, then another, each movement measured and deliberate. The crowd didn't notice immediately. Why would they notice another beggar's movement? But those near him, the flower sellers and pie vendors, saw something change in his bearing, saw the transformation of a broken man into something else, something they couldn't quite name but recognized nonetheless. "I accept your Majesty's challenge." The voice cut through the laughter like a knife through silk. It was not loud, but it carried the voice of a man who had once commanded workshops, who had trained apprentices, who had negotiated with nobility back when his name meant something. The square fell silent in stages, the laughter dying in waves from those closest to Thomas outward, until the only sound was the distant clatter of a horse's hooves on cobblestone somewhere beyond the square. All eyes turned toward the source of the voice. The aristocracy craned their necks, stood on tiptoes, tried to locate who had dared interrupt their entertainment. When they found him, this grey-haired wreck of a man in rags, leaning on his cane at the edge of the crowd, confusion rippled through their ranks. Was this a joke? Was he mad? Did he not understand his place? Edmund's smile froze on his face for just a heartbeat, before transforming into something more predatory, more anticipatory. This was better than he'd hoped. Not just failure, but public, witnessed, undeniable failure. The humiliation would be complete. "Approach then, beggar!" Edmund's voice boomed with false generosity. "Let all of London witness what happens when ambition exceeds ability. Let this be a lesson in knowing one's station." He gestured grandly toward the carriage. "By all means, make history. Show us the talents that poverty has taught you." The crowd parted before Thomas like the Red Sea before Moses, though not out of respect. They moved away as if poverty might be contagious, might somehow transfer through proximity. Ladies pulled their skirts aside. Lords turned their faces away. Children held firmly by nursemaids were told not to look directly at him, as if he were some disturbing sight that might corrupt young minds. Thomas moved through this gauntlet of contempt with steady steps. He had dropped his cane, no longer needed it, no longer wanted it. His pace was slow but sure, and with each step something remarkable happened. His posture continued to straighten, his shoulders squared, his head lifted until he was looking not down at the ground, but forward, directly at the golden carriage that had been his life's masterwork. "He walks like he owns the place," someone hissed. "The arrogance of the poor knows no bounds," another voice added. "This will be delicious," a third murmured, anticipation dripping from every word. Duke Blackwell leaned toward Edmund and whispered, just loud enough for nearby lords to hear, "I do hope he doesn't expire from the effort, Your Majesty, though I suppose removing one beggar from our streets would be a service to the realm." The surrounding men chuckled darkly. Thomas reached the carriage and stood before it, one hand reaching out slowly, almost reverently, toward the gleaming door panel. His fingers, those gnarled and trembling fingers, stopped inches from the surface, hovering in the air as if he were blessing it, or as if touching it might break his heart. If this story has moved you so far, let us know in the comments what city and country you're watching from, and leave your like so we can keep sharing stories that touch hearts around the world. The aristocracy watched with bated breath, expecting him to falter, to realize the impossibility of the task, to slink away in shame. Edmund stood with arms crossed, his smile now a smirk of absolute confidence. The sabotaged axle was subtle work. Even his best engineers would need hours to diagnose the problem, let alone fix it. A beggar with no tools, no knowledge, no assistance. Impossible, laughable, perfect. But Thomas Whitmore was not looking at the carriage the way a beggar would look at an impossible treasure. He was looking at it the way a father looks at a lost child, the way an artist looks at his masterpiece, the way a craftsman looks at the work of his hands and sees not gold and prestige, but hours of dedication, drops of sweat, the memory of every decision made, every challenge overcome, every innovation implemented. His right hand finally made contact with the door panel, fingers spread wide, palm flat against the burled walnut. His eyes closed for a moment, and in that darkness behind his lids, time collapsed. He was no longer 72, but 45, standing in his workshop, Whitmore and Son, Masterworks of London, with Richard beside him, both of them arguing good-naturedly about the angle of the suspension, the placement of the springs, the tension required in the leather straps. "The coach must ride like a cloud, Father," Richard had insisted, his young face serious with concentration. "Kings should not feel the imperfections of their realm." "Then we build it to be smoother than any road in England," Thomas had replied, ruffling his son's hair. "We build it to perfection." And they had. God help him, they had. Thomas's eyes opened, and those storm-grey irises were suddenly sharp, focused, alive with an intensity that made several aristocrats shift uncomfortably without knowing why. He moved around the carriage slowly, his hands trailing across surfaces, touching, feeling, reading the vehicle like a blind man reads Braille, like a musician runs fingers across the keys of a familiar piano. His fingers found the hinges on the door, 3 of them, brass beneath the gold plating, set at precisely calculated angles to distribute weight evenly. He had argued with the metalsmith for 2 days about these hinges, insisting on a specific alloy that would last generations. The metalsmith had thought him mad to care so much about something no one would see. But Thomas had cared. Richard had cared. They had built this carriage not for a king, but for the craft itself, for the pure satisfaction of making something so well that it transcended its purpose and became art. He moved to the wheels, those 5-foot marvels of engineering. His knees, arthritic and painful, bent as he knelt on the cobblestones, getting eye level with the hub. Around him the laughter was starting again, quiet at first, building slowly. "Look at him pray to it," someone cackled. "Perhaps he thinks his beggar god will start the carriage." Another voice, "How pathetic! He's given up before even trying." But Thomas wasn't praying. He was counting. His eyes tracked the spokes, 16 per wheel, alternating in width by 2 millimeters, a design innovation that distributed stress more evenly than traditional uniform spokes. He and Richard had tested 7 different configurations before settling on this one. Most wheelwrights thought uniform spokes were sufficient. Thomas and Richard had known better. His hands moved to the wheel itself, touching, pressing, feeling the tension in the wood, the elasticity that had been achieved through a specific treatment process. Soaking the wood in a solution Thomas had developed himself, a mixture that strengthened the grain while maintaining flexibility. The formula had been his secret, something he had planned to pass down through generations of Whitmores. 1 generation, that's all it had lasted. 1 generation cut short by flame and conspiracy. Thomas's jaw tightened, but his hands remained steady. He moved to the axle, the sabotaged axle, though he didn't know that yet. His fingers found it beneath the carriage body, in the shadows where gold leaf gave way to honest metal. And here, his fingers stopped, hesitated, felt something wrong. The axle was slightly off-center, not much, perhaps 3 degrees, invisible to the eye, barely perceptible to the touch. But to Thomas Whitmore, who had forged this axle himself, who had measured and remeasured, who had tested the stress tolerances and calculated the load distribution, who had spent 6 weeks perfecting this single component, to him, 3 degrees might as well have been 3 miles. Someone had tampered with it. Understanding flooded through him, cold and clarifying. This was not a fair challenge. This was never meant to be won. This was sport, the entertainment of watching a helpless creature struggle before the inevitable conclusion. The king had sabotaged his own carriage, Thomas's own masterwork, to create this moment of absolute degradation. For a lesser man, this revelation might have been crushing, but Thomas Whitmore had already been crushed once, had already lost everything worth losing except his life and his memories. What was one more injustice in a lifetime of injustice? What was one more cruelty from a crown that had already murdered his son? Something hardened in Thomas then, something that had been soft and yielding for 20 years. Not anger. Anger was too hot, too unfocused. This was colder, sharper. This was resolve. This was the decision of a man who has nothing left to lose and therefore cannot be defeated. Not truly, not in the ways that matter. Thomas stood, his movements fluid despite his age, and walked to the back of the carriage. He located a specific panel, decorative, or so anyone else would think, and pressed on it in 3 specific places in sequence. The panel popped open on hidden hinges, revealing a storage compartment that even the king's engineers didn't know existed. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were the original tools Richard and Thomas had used in the construction. They had hidden them there as a sort of time capsule, a joke between them about how maybe someday someone would find them and know who had truly built this masterpiece. Thomas pulled out a small iron lever, maybe 8 inches long, with a hook on one end. It was a special tool he had designed specifically for adjusting tension on the leather suspension straps while the carriage was assembled. Something that couldn't be done with standard tools. He had exactly 3 of these in the world. 1 had been in his workshop when it burned, 1 was in his hand, and 1 was hidden in this carriage. The aristocracy had gone quiet again, but differently this time. The laughter had died not from shock, but from confusion. What was he doing? Where had that come from? How did he know about that panel? Their champagne glasses paused halfway to lips. Conversations died mid-sentence. Even Edmund's smile faltered, uncertainty flickering across his face like a candle in a draught. Thomas didn't acknowledge them. He didn't have time for their confusion or their concern. He slid beneath the carriage with surprising agility for a man of his years, disappearing into the shadows between the golden body and the cobblestones. For several minutes, nothing happened. The crowd grew restless. Some began to drift away, assuming the beggar had given up or died under there. Edmund's smile returned, wider now, victorious. "It seems," he announced to those remaining, "that reality has taught our ambitious friend the lesson I intended. Sometimes the best education comes from failure." But then sounds emerged from beneath the carriage. Not the sounds of struggle or confusion, but the sounds of competent work. Metal sliding against metal with precision, the creak of adjustment, the tap-tap-tap of something being aligned. Those few in the crowd who had any mechanical knowledge cocked their heads, listening, trying to understand what they were hearing. Inside that space beneath the carriage, in the darkness that smelled of oil and leather and old wood, Thomas Whitmore worked with the certainty of a surgeon performing a familiar operation. His trembling hands, they weren't trembling anymore, moved with the muscle memory of 50 years. The hook on his lever found the exact anchor point he had designed into the axle system, a redundancy he had built in specifically for maintenance purposes. He applied pressure at a precise angle, not too much, or the mount would crack, not too little, or nothing would move. 3 degrees of misalignment meant he needed to apply approximately 18 pounds of force at a 47-degree angle for 11 seconds. He counted silently. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3 Mississippi. At 7 Mississippi, he felt the axle begin to yield. Metal sliding back into its proper alignment, the geometry resolving itself like a mathematical equation, reaching its solution. At 11 Mississippi, he heard the click, subtle, inaudible to anyone not listening for it specifically, that indicated the mount had reseated properly. The axle was fixed. But Thomas wasn't finished. He continued his inspection, his hands moving along the undercarriage with the speed of familiarity. He checked the spring tensions. All correct, naturally. The King's engineers hadn't found those. He verified the stress points on the chassis joins, still solid after 35 years, because he and Richard had built them to last a century. He examined the wood grain on the support beams, looking for any cracks or signs of weakness that time might have introduced. Everything was as he had made it. Everything was perfect. His legacy, despite everything, had endured. Thomas emerged from beneath the carriage, and when he stood, something in the square's atmosphere changed. Dust coated his ragged clothes, and a streak of grease marked his left cheek. But his bearing was that of a master craftsman who had just completed important work. Not a beggar, not a victim, a professional. He walked to the driver's seat, that high, leather-padded seat designed to give optimal visibility while maintaining dignified posture, and climbed up with steady movements. His hands found the reins, and in that moment, 20 years dissolved. These reins he had braided from the finest leather himself, working them to exactly the right suppleness, dyeing them with a color he had mixed personally to match the royal crest. His hands knew their weight, their texture, their response to the slightest movement. The horses, a matched pair of chestnuts that had been standing patiently through all of this, felt the change immediately. Animals are sensitive to such things. They sensed competence in the hands holding their reins, felt the difference between someone who knew what they were doing and someone who was pretending. Their ears pricked forward, their muscles tensed in anticipation, ready to work. Thomas clicked his tongue, a specific pattern, one he had learned from his own father, passed down through 3 generations of Whitmores who had worked with horses and carriages, and gently, almost imperceptibly, adjusted the reins. The horses stepped forward. The wheels, those magnificent 5-foot wheels with their alternating spokes and specially treated wood, began to turn, smoothly, silently. Perfectly, the golden carriage moved. London fell silent. It wasn't just the absence of sound, it was the presence of impossibility. The carriage that the king's own engineers couldn't start, that had been deliberately sabotaged, that should, by all logical reasoning, remain immobile, it glided across Trafalgar Square, like a ship across calm water, like a bird through clear air, like something that had been waiting its entire existence for this moment to prove what it had always been: perfection. Thomas drove it in a wide circle around the square, his hands steady on the reins, his posture upright and dignified. The afternoon sun caught the gold leaf and threw back light in dazzling patterns. The wheels rolled without a sound, except the gentle click of horseshoes on cobblestone. Ladies' fans stopped fluttering, lords' mouths hung open. Children stared in wonder, freed for a moment from their nursemaids' restraining hands. Duke Blackwell's champagne glass slipped from his fingers and shattered on the cobblestones. The sound seemed impossibly loud in the silence, and he flinched as if it had been a gunshot. Lady Pemberton's fan slid from her limp fingers. Young lords, who had been laughing minutes before now, looked at each other in confusion, seeking confirmation that they were seeing what they thought they were seeing. Thomas completed his circle and brought the carriage to a stop directly before King Edmund Sutherland II. The horses stood perfectly still, their training evident in every line of their bodies. Thomas set the brake, a mechanism he himself had designed, innovative for its time, and climbed down from the driver's seat with measured grace. He stood before the king, and for the first time their eyes met directly. Edmund's face had gone pale beneath his powder and rouge. His mouth worked soundlessly, trying to form words that wouldn't come. Around him, his courtiers had drawn back slightly, unconsciously, as if the impossible made them physically uncomfortable. Have you ever witnessed a moment when everything you thought you knew revealed itself to be wrong? Tell us in the comments. Your stories matter to us. Thomas walked slowly around the carriage one more time, his right hand trailing across its surface, touching it the way one touches a beloved face, memorizing through fingertips what the heart already knows. When he reached the door with the royal crest, his hand stopped, fingers spread across the emblazoned lion and unicorn. "This carriage," Thomas said, his voice quiet but carrying across the square with perfect clarity, "is 35 years old." His fingers traced the outline of the crest, following the curves of the lion's mane, the spiral of the unicorn's horn. "I know, because I carved this crest myself. I mixed the gold leaf, I calculated the weight distribution, I treated the wood, I forged the axle. I braided the reins." He turned to face Edmund, and in his eyes was not anger, but something far more powerful, absolute certainty. "My name is Thomas Whitmore. I was once the master of Whitmore and Son, the finest carriage makers in England. This vehicle, your prized possession, Your Majesty, was the last project I completed with my son, Richard Whitmore, before your father's false accusations of treason destroyed our workshop and murdered my boy in the fire that followed." The silence that followed these words was different from the silence that had come before. This was the silence of recognition, of scandal, of a truth that had been suppressed surfacing like a body from deep water. The name Whitmore and Son rippled through the crowd like wind through wheat. Those old enough to remember it spoke it to those younger. "Whitmore, I thought they were all dead. The Whitmore workshops. They made the royal family's carriages for 3 generations. But there was that scandal. The father said it was a conspiracy. No one believed him. The charge was that I refused to convert my workshop to build weapons for the king's wars. The truth was that I had taken business from certain influential people who didn't appreciate the competition." He turned back to the carriage, his hand still resting on the crest. "Your father, Edmund's father, chose to believe the accusations because it was politically convenient. My workshop was burned. My son died trying to save our tools. I was left with nothing but my memories and my skills." Thomas looked down at his ragged clothing, his dirty hands, his worn shoes. For 20 years, I have lived in the streets of the city I once served with pride. I have been invisible, dismissed, despised. I have been called beggar, wretch, useless. I have heard laughter at my expense so many times, I stopped hearing it at all. He straightened, his shoulders square, his head high. But I never forgot who I was. I never forgot what I knew. And I never forgot this carriage. The last thing Richard and I built together before you took him from me. Thomas's hand lifted from the crest, and he stepped back from the carriage, creating space between himself and it. The gesture was deliberate, symbolic. Keep your gold, your majesty. Keep your jewels. Keep your carriage. I did not come here to reclaim possessions. I came to prove something far more important. That dignity does not vanish with fortune, and mastery does not die in poverty. He turned to face Edmund directly, and the king of England, ruler of an empire on which the sun never set, took an involuntary step backward. I could have told you that the axle was misaligned, Thomas said quietly. I could have told you that you had sabotaged it, that this was never meant to be a fair challenge, but I didn't need to. Because true craftsmanship doesn't require fair challenges. It requires only truth, skill, and the courage to remember who you are even when the world has forgotten. The square was so silent that the flap of a pigeon's wings sounded like thunder. Edmund's mouth opened and closed, but no words emerged. What could he say? What defense existed against truth spoken with such quiet power? That carriage, Thomas continued, his voice carrying to every corner of the square, to every watching face, to every soul present, was my son's last creation. Every wheel, every panel, every joint. Richard's hands touched them all. His laughter lives in its suspension. His dreams live in its design. His love lives in every curve and corner. Thomas's voice broke slightly on these words, the only crack in his composure. Before you killed him, a gasp rippled through the crowd, but Thomas held up his hand, forestalling the reaction. Not with your own hands, perhaps, not deliberately maybe, but with your father's greed, with the corruption of men who valued power over justice, with a system that crushes excellence when it becomes inconvenient. Yes, you killed him, and you killed me too, in every way but the final one. He was silent for a moment, collecting himself. When he spoke again, his voice was steady once more. But here's what you didn't kill, your majesty, and what you can never kill. The work itself, the craft, the skill passed from hand to hand, from father to son, from master to apprentice. You can burn workshops and murder craftsmen. You can steal credit and destroy reputations, but the work endures. The carriage still rolls 35 years later, as smooth as the day we finished it. The joints still hold, the wheels still turn, because we built it right, because we built it with love, because we built it to last beyond our own lives. Thomas looked around at the assembled aristocracy, at their shocked faces, at their expensive clothes and their comfortable lives built on the labor and genius of people they never acknowledged. I don't want your carriage, he said. I don't want your gold or your apology or your pity. What I want is for everyone here to remember this day. Remember that the beggar you mocked built the thing you treasured. Remember that the wretch you despised possessed skills you could never buy. Remember that poverty and dignity are not opposites, and that a man's worth is not measured by his circumstances, but by his character. He turned one last time to the carriage, his masterwork, his son's memorial. His hand touched it gently, a benediction, a farewell. Goodbye, Richard, he whispered, so quietly that only those nearest heard. Your father kept the faith. Your work still stands. You can rest now. Thomas walked back through the crowd, and this time they parted for him differently. Not with revulsion, but with something approaching awe or shame or recognition. Some reached out as if to touch him, though none dared. Some bowed their heads. One elderly lady pressed a handkerchief to her eyes, weeping openly. As he reached the edge of the square, Thomas paused and turned back one final time. His eyes found Edmund, still standing frozen beside the golden carriage, and he spoke his final words with the weight of absolute moral authority. "A crown may grant power, your majesty, but it cannot grant wisdom, honor, or grace. Those must be earned. Today you learned that all the gold in England cannot buy what a poor man possesses in his heart and hands. I hope for the sake of your kingdom that you remember this lesson." And then Thomas Whitmore walked away from Trafalgar Square, from the golden carriage, from the king and the aristocracy and the spectacle. He walked slowly, with dignity, his head high, his shoulders straight. He retrieved his cane, not because he needed it, but because it was his, and continued walking until he disappeared into the London streets, back into invisibility, back into poverty. But he was no longer broken. He had proven what needed proving, not to them, but to himself. He had honored his son's memory. He had reminded the world, or at least one small corner of it, that greatness lives not in crowns and castles, but in the work of hands and the strength of spirit. Behind him, in Trafalgar Square, the crowd began to disperse slowly, as if waking from a dream. Conversations started quietly, then grew in volume. The story would spread, as such stories do, through London and beyond. The tale of the beggar who built the king's carriage, who proved his mastery without tools or assistance, who refused gold and demanded only respect, who reminded the mighty that they too are mortal, and that their possessions are built by hands they never see. King Edmund Sutherland II stood beside the golden carriage for a long time after Thomas left, staring at it as if seeing it for the first time. His courtiers maintained a respectful distance, uncertain what to say or do. The Duke tried once to approach, to offer some platitude, but Edmund waved him away with a sharp gesture. The king ran his own hand across the door panel, following the path Thomas's fingers had taken. He tried to see what Thomas had seen, to understand what Thomas had understood, but he couldn't. The carriage was still just a carriage to him, beautiful, expensive, prestigious, but not alive, not loved, not imbued with the soul of its creator. That evening, as the sun set over London, Edmund summoned his historians and archivists. "I want to know everything," he commanded. "Everything about Thomas Whitmore, everything about the accusations, everything about the fire. I want the truth." It took them 3 weeks to assemble the full story, and when Edmund read it, he wept. Perhaps the first honest tears he had shed in his entire pampered life. The accusations had been fabricated. The fire had been arson, ordered by Edmund's father's Minister of Trade, who had indeed been taking bribes from Whitmore's competitors. Richard had died saving not tools, but the workers trapped inside when the mob attacked. Thomas had been telling the truth about everything. Edmund issued a royal pardon, cleared the Whitmore name, and tried to find Thomas to offer restitution. But Thomas Whitmore had vanished into London's vast underworld of poverty, as invisible as he had been before that afternoon in Trafalgar Square. Some said he had left the city. Some said he had died. Some said he had simply returned to his life of quiet anonymity, having no more need to prove himself to anyone. The golden carriage remained in the royal collection, but Edmund never rode in it again. Instead, he had it placed in a museum with a plaque that read, "Crafted by Master Thomas Whitmore and Richard Whitmore, 1770. The finest example of British carriage making. May their skill and sacrifice never be forgotten." The story of that day, of the king who mocked a beggar and learned that wealth cannot buy wisdom, became legend. Parents told it to their children, masters to their apprentices, teachers to their students. It was adapted into plays and songs, painted in oils and sketched in charcoal, written in poems and prose. But the most important audience for that story was never the public. It was the craftsmen and servants, the builders and makers, the invisible people who create the world that others inhabit but never acknowledge. To them, Thomas Whitmore's story was not just a tale of poetic justice. It was proof that their work mattered, that their skills had value, that their dignity could not be stripped away by circumstance or contempt. In workshops across England and beyond, apprentices learning their trades would hear the story and understand. Build it right. Build it with love. Build it to last, because the work endures when everything else is gone. The work is immortal. The work is truth. And somewhere in London, if you listened carefully, you might hear the echo of Richard Whitmore's voice, speaking words his father never forgot. The craft we create with our hands, Father, never dies. It lives in every wheel that turns, every joint that holds, every work of beauty that outlasts us all. The lesson of Trafalgar Square endured long after those who witnessed it had turned to dust. True greatness needs no crown, and royal arrogance always bows before the talent that survives even the cruelest injustice. Dignity cannot be purchased, cannot be granted, cannot be stolen. It can only be claimed by those brave enough to remember who they are when the world insists they are nothing. In the end, Edmund's golden carriage continued to exist as a monument to something he never intended: the superiority of character over circumstance, the triumph of truth over power, the victory of a father's love over a kingdom's cruelty. And Thomas Whitmore, invisible, forgotten, dismissed, despised, had achieved something no king ever could. He had transformed his greatest loss into meaning, his deepest grief into purpose, his most profound humiliation into humanity's most important reminder that every person contains universes, that every beggar might be a master, that every forgotten life might hold the keys to wonders we can barely imagine. His story became immortal, not because he sought immortality, but because he sought only to honor his son and preserve his craft. In doing so, he taught a lesson that transcends time, place, and circumstance. When you know who you are, when you understand your worth, when you remember your purpose, no power on earth can truly diminish you. The work endures, the craft survives, the truth wins. Always, if this story has touched your heart, moved your spirit, or reminded you of your own worth, share it. Let it reach someone who needs to remember that their value is not determined by others' judgments. Comment below with your thoughts, your city, your own stories of hidden greatness revealed. Like this story, so we can continue sharing tales that illuminate the human capacity for dignity, resilience, and transcendent craftsmanship. Because somewhere, right now, another Thomas Whitmore is being dismissed, mocked, or forgotten. And somewhere, a golden carriage built by invisible hands is rolling smoothly forward, waiting for the moment when its creator's truth will finally be told. Never forget, the beggar you pass might be a master, the servant might be a genius, the forgotten might be the only one who remembers what truly matters. Treat every person as if they might be the builder of your most precious possession, because they might be, because they are. The story of Thomas Whitmore and King Edmund Sutherland II is not just history. It's a mirror reflecting the choices we make every day about how we value others, how we measure worth, how we acknowledge the hands that build our world. Choose wisely, build well. Remember always that dignity and craftsmanship outlast crowns and gold. The wheel keeps turning.